This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this is episode 751 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. A question that's been popping up since the launch of the Late Round Prospect Guide surrounds how I value tight ends. If I have models at running back and wide receiver, and those models help me, what do I do at the tight end position? Well, to be fair, I do have a tight end model that I've been working on over the last few weeks. Things finally clicked, and I've been moving forward with one. For anyone who's subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football newsletter, you got a couple of emails to your inbox just last week about that model. But honestly, I don't put as much thought into that position as I do the other two positions. And there are some obvious reasons for that. Tight ends are valued differently in fantasy football compared to running backs and wide receivers. And it's because the position doesn't matter as much in fantasy. You're only starting one of them. The demand is lower. Each 12-team league is only starting 12 tight ends, when you're starting way more than 12 running backs and way more than 12 wide receivers. That leads to fewer tight ends giving you a significant edge in fantasy. Imagine a world where your 12-team league was starting 30 tight ends in a given week instead of 12. Those lower-tiered tight ends would barely be scoring any fantasy points. A lot of them would be giving you zeros every week. In that scenario, the standard middle-of-the-road tight end one, they're giving you a better edge because the baseline has shifted. Worse tight ends are being started, giving the higher-end tight ends more of that edge. But we know that scenario isn't common. I mean, some leagues don't even have a tight end spot at all. That naturally makes fewer and fewer tight ends relevant in fantasy. And with fewer and fewer tight ends being relevant, our approach to the position is to truly just chase gold. Getting a bronze or a silver level tight end, that's fine. But we want Travis Kelce or Mark Andrews or George Kittle. And clearly those tight ends aren't popping up very frequently. This makes the process for evaluating tight ends more difficult because you're chasing this ceiling that doesn't come very often. It comes more often at running back and wide receiver because our range for a ceiling is just wider. They're more usable because we're starting more of them. There's an easier chance for those players to really make a difference versus the rest of their position. But at tight end, we're not getting difference makers all the time or every single year. We really only have a handful of true difference-making tight ends every decade. But there's this other component to tight end evaluation that I want to focus on today. Not only is the position just hard to nail down because only a select few will become truly elite, but based on dynasty market dynamics, investing in the position during your rookie drafts probably isn't a good idea either. Let's start by looking at general rookie draft data. I analyzed MyFantasyLeague.com rookie draft average draft position data since 2011 in an attempt to see how well we do at essentially ranking tight ends. Quite simply, I looked at the correlation between average draft position versus a player's best season in points per game across his first 3 years in the league. And I did this at running back and wide receiver too. Of the three positions, tight end had the weakest correlation, but it really wasn't by much. All three positions were actually pretty close. It wasn't significant enough for me to say, hey, we're really bad at ranking tight ends compared to how we rank other positions post-draft and entering the NFL. So that's good for tight ends, even though we're technically worse at projecting how well they do. The problem with investing in them during your rookie draft is deeper than that, though. We may be okay at finding which tight ends to pick compared to other positions. But what actually happens in the market after these players start playing in the NFL? Or after you make a selection and draft a tight end during your rookie draft? Now, I've done studies on how rookies appreciate in value in the past. And while doing those studies, I've talked about how your dynasty roster can sort of be looked at in two ways. The first way is straight up production, or how many fantasy points that roster is going to score. In a redraft league, that's all we care about. We just want as many fantasy points as possible, and we don't care what players help us do that. It's not that straightforward in Dynasty, because there's this second component, which is value. The value of a team is more about the future. It's about the pieces in place. It's no different in the NFL either. There are teams who may be productive, who may have a shot to win it all this season. But are they valuable? Do they have pieces on their roster that'll be there for years to come? You can't underestimate the value piece, because that's what helps create a winnable roster year in and year out. You, of course, need to make sure that your team is eventually productive, but having value on your team can lead to a ton of that production. Now, given what I'm looking at today, I want to discuss the value component of dynasty roster building. The question I'm asking is, if I draft a tight end during a rookie draft, am I gaining value with that player more so than players that I draft at running back or wide receiver? And to help answer that question, I looked at Dynasty League Football's startup ADP, which dates back to 2014. So we've got 8 years of startup data that also includes next season data. And that next season data is important because we need it to help judge whether or not a player actually increased in value from one year to the next. We don't want to draft players who in year one were at X, and then year two, they were at X minus Y in terms of startup ADP. We want these players to be at X plus Y. We want them to improve. Now let's start by just looking at every single player who's included in this data set. So every single player who's been taken in a startup draft since 2014. And since we're looking to see if rookie tight ends are worth the investment, let's just focus on rookies. In this sample, we have 182 rookie wide receivers, 150 rookie running backs, and 58 rookie tight ends. Of those wide receivers, a little over 36% of them saw their value increase year over year, meaning their average draft position in startups increased after their rookie season and into the second year of their career. That number was almost 39% at running back. So running backs appreciated in value better than wide receivers did across the entirety of this sample. At tight end, that was under 35%. So when looking across this massive sample, tight ends increased their market value worst. That's when looking at this in a binary way. But I don't think it's really fair to stop there. The reason these numbers are so low is because there are a whole lot of players getting drafted at like pick 200 in a startup draft, and those guys have almost no chance of becoming anything in fantasy football. They basically become undrafted the next year. What we really should be focused on are the higher end picks, or at least the players who have a decent shot at becoming fantasy relevant. So instead of looking at the whole sample here, let's look at startup ADP of players drafted in the top 150. When we do that, we find that 54% of rookie wide receivers saw their ADPs improve from year one to year two. That number was a little over 51% at running back. And those numbers match what I've talked about before on the show. Rookies generally improve their ADP from one year to the next, which makes plenty of sense because they're young and older players then get knocked down. Except at tight end, that is. When looking at rookie tight ends who were drafted in the top 150 of startups since 2014, there have only been 15 of them. So roughly 2 are entering that range every single year. And of those players, just 46.7% of them saw their ADP improve year over year. So again, wide receiver in this top 150 range, they improved their ADP from year one to year two at a 54% rate. Running back was at 51, 52%. Tight end, 46 to 47%. So if you have a rookie tight end who's got a startup ADP in the top 150, he has better odds to see his ADP decrease year over year than increase. Now, if we shift to the top 100 in startup ADP, our sample of tight ends obviously is not very big. There haven't been many rookie tight ends with a top 100 startup ADP since 2014. But among the players who have gotten there, the numbers are even more dramatic. We've had 60 rookie wide receivers with top 100 startup ADP since 2014. About 57% of them have seen their price increase from one year to the next, from year one to year two. That's a pretty strong investment. At running back, that's nearly identical. It's a little higher than 58%. At tight end, we've had 7 rookies with top 100 startup ADPs. Again, the sample size isn't massive, but it's what we're working with here. Only 3 of them saw that value increase year over year. So at each level, tight ends are improving their year one to year two average draft position in startups at a much lower rate than what we see from wide receivers and running backs. And in general, rookie tight ends are decreasing in value more often than they're increasing in value. But that's also not the whole problem. We could stop there, but we also have to look at market value ceiling here too. How high a player's value can reach is an important component that we absolutely have to factor in. Since 2014, there's been one tight end, who's had a year two startup ADP higher than 40. That was Kyle Pitts. Only 3 tight ends were higher than pick 72, which represents the first 6 rounds of a 12-team startup. Again, this is largely because of supply and demand. Tight ends just don't matter that much in fantasy football, so their costs are driven down, even if they're some of the best players at their position. When you select a tight end in your rookie draft, you're not simply selecting them and just moving on. You're taking them over a running back or a wide receiver. AKA, there's an opportunity cost when you take one of these tight ends. And that's very, very key to this discussion. Maybe think of it this way. A lot of the good tight ends in a rookie draft will generally get drafted in the second or third round. There have been 4 since 2011 who have gone in round 1 on average. Kyle Pitts, TJ Hawkinson, Eric Ebron, and OJ Howard. That's telling us that the majority of pretty good to high-end tight ends will go after round 1 of your rookie draft. So let's look at this startup draft sample and focus on all running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends who were selected in round 2 or round 3 of rookie drafts. So after pick 12, but before pick 37. That leaves us with 66 wide receivers, 45 running backs, and 14 tight ends. Of those second and third round rookie draft wide receivers, 36% of them were able to give you a top 75 startup ADP in year 2. That number was 20% at running back and 21% at tight end. To put that another way, we've got all these wideouts, running backs, and tight ends getting drafted in round 2 or round 3 of rookie drafts. So they're all valued similarly entering the league. But wide receivers tend to hit that top 75 in startup draft ADP the following year at the highest rate. Running backs and tight ends were actually pretty similar. When you increase that to look at top 50 startup ADP, wide receivers hit that mark at a 23% rate. Running backs are at 11%, tight ends 7%. And then when looking at top 25 startup ADPs, 5% of wide receivers from the second and third round of rookie drafts have gotten there. 9% of running backs have gotten there. And absolutely 0 tight ends have gotten there. To put this all another way, if you're looking for a ceiling, if you're looking for a player to increase his value by a whole lot and be a top 3 round pick in Dynasty in year 2, tight end is absolutely not the way to go. We see running backs get there out of the second and third round of rookie drafts, and we see wide receivers get there too. Maybe not frequently, but they get there. Tight ends literally just never get there. Tight ends who get selected in round 2 or round 3 of rookie drafts are not seeing year 2 ADP in the top 25 or the top 30. It's just not happening. At least you have a shot at that if you're throwing darts at running backs and wide receivers. So let's wrap this up and talk about what all this data means. We're not as good at ranking tight ends post-draft as we are running backs and wide receivers, but I don't think it's significant enough to worry about. When we focus on startup drafts, tight ends tend to not improve on their startup ADP from year 1 to year 2 at the same rate as wide receivers and running backs. That's not good for the position. Moreover, and probably the most important piece to this, tight ends rarely have super high costs even after their rookie seasons. When you compare running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends who get drafted in round 2 or round 3 in rookie drafts, the running backs and wide receivers are hitting higher startup ADPs in year 2 at a much higher rate than tight ends are. If you were to use a rookie pick on a tight end, you're almost admitting that you're not worried about how high of a ceiling that pick may have on the value front. We just don't see tight ends jump into the top 3 or so rounds of startup drafts very often after year 1. It actually hasn't happened outside of Kyle Pitts since 2014. And he was definitely not a second or third round rookie draft pick. But it does happen at running back and wide receiver. Again, maybe not a ton, but it does happen. That's why investing in rookie tight ends is generally not necessary, at least in a typical non-tight end premium league. They may increase their value year over year, but it's generally not by a whole lot, or at least it's generally not to levels where you'd have to give up a ton to acquire them before year 2. Now, clearly this is a high-level look at the position and how the market works. There may be individual circumstances where it makes plenty of sense to go after a tight end in your rookie draft. It's not an avoid-at-all-costs scenario. This is based on history. And based on history, throwing a dart at running back or wide receiver in the second or third round of your rookie draft has generally been a better idea than going after a tight end. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Remember to check out the Late Round Prospect Guide over on LateRound.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening, everyone. I will talk to you later in the week.